Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the VRX webinar, VR and AR, what's real, what's hype, and what's the future. It gives me great pleasure to welcome our guests for this morning, who are Stephen Cann, who looks after VR and AR strategy at Google, Stephanie Llamas from SuperData, who looks after their XR strategy, and Amy Peck, who is founder of EndeavorVR and Chief Strategy Officer at Periscape. Vinay Narayan from HTC Vive is due to be joining us. We can't yet see him on the system, but we're hoping he's going to be joining us in the next couple of minutes. So, yeah, without further ado, let me hand over to Amy Peck, who's your moderator for the session, and enjoy. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. Hi, thanks, Pete. Hello, everyone. I know that Vinay is actually at an offsite today, so he is going to be stepping out of that and joining us in short order. And I'd love to get started. I mean, yes, the title of our webinar today is very relevant. What's real? What's hype? What's the future? So I can think of no better way to really start, than by looking at the numbers. And I know, Stephanie, you at SuperData have been, doing a lot of research. What are the numbers telling us in terms of, market size? Where are we relevant to, relative to some of the predictions over the last couple of years?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that we've tried to do here, at least, is
Stephanie, are you,
really
there you go.
be as realistic as possible. And yeah, can you hear me okay? Hello?
Yes,
Hi, so.
Yes, I can hear you.
So, I think here at SuperData, we're just trying to be as realistic as possible, which, in the last couple of years, we've tried to create numbers or at least, forecast the market in a way that really gives a realistic point of view of what that growth will look like. So this year, I think in 2018, we're going to see just under $4 billion worldwide attributed to virtual reality on both the hardware and software side. And we see most of that coming from hardware, which is something that we will continue to see for quite some time as the penetration rate continues to grow for virtual reality. So something that I've been looking at pretty closely lately, and I know Amy, you've been as well at Periscape, is location-based entertainment. So we're finding that location-based or out-of-home entertainment is going to be a really key driver of adoption in the industry. And so these numbers will continue to be overwhelmed by hardware as we start to see awareness grow. And so that's one of the ways that will allow penetration for the market. So in 2021, we anticipate virtual reality to hit $15 billion, with about 10 of that coming from hardware. And there's going to continue to be a challenge for the next couple of years in terms of monetization and getting a monetization model out there for in-home virtual reality in particular that really works for consumers. And so that's why we anticipate that software will still be about half of what hardware will be in the next 5 years. But it doesn't, it's not to say that that's not really impressive growth, especially when you consider just how difficult it's been for the industry to create awareness of the market and of headsets for consumers. So, that's where at least virtual reality comes from. On the augmented reality side, there's a lot of potential in mobile that we're seeing, and there's a lot more opportunity for monetization there in a more straightforward way. So that's why we see that being a bigger driver of awareness. If you look at software of virtual reality being 5 billion by 2021, on the other side, mobile augmented reality software will hit 17 billion. And that's just really a testament to the fact that mobile is a little bit more of a straightforward monetization model and opportunity. And so as virtual reality kind of gets its bearings, you know, we have to be realistic about that and understand that that's okay, you know, not to over hype the market for the next few years, but that there are really accessible opportunities in something like mobile AR in the near term.
That's great. And Stephen, I've seen a number of your talks, you know, on the Google strategy on AR, VR. And so how do these numbers shape, you know, the Google strategy going forward? And what are you looking towards as, you know, the drivers of the market relative to Google?
Yeah. I just say overall that, you know, when I hear the number, you know, 4 billion of revenue in VR, and it's, you know, it's been growing, so it's 1 billion and then 3 billion and 4 and so on. It's really exciting. This is the beginning of a new commercial industry. And I think we've all believed that and see that and talked about it, but revenue like this is evidence of it. So it's very exciting to see that kind of revenue coming in. And that revenue is, you know, that's revenue from customers and consumers, and that is revenue that's going straight into, you know, companies can now reinvest that, and it can help drive down the experience curves on hardware, and definitely helps to grow the sophistication on the software side of what developers can do. So overall, like these numbers, these trends, these opportunities are very, very exciting and inform a very a bullish, excited, you know, and optimistic view of both AR and VR here at Google. You know, to get a little bit more specifically around kind of our plans at Google and how we're thinking about it. You know, going forward on the VR side, we see continued momentum, excitement, and growth and engagement around immersive video. We think that's a trend that's really, really important. And I think the revenue that comes out of that is a little bit harder to capture in some of the forecasts, because a lot of it will be, you know, advertising revenue or existing media models. And frankly, a lot of the views will come from folks that may not be in headsets. But you think about immersive video and those monetization, advertising monetization models, there's a lot of potential there. And then VR, you know, I think it's going to be about the form factors getting more polished over time, and over the next couple of years, I see the form factors getting incrementally better, lighter weight, longer battery life, better graphics, and so on. And so I think that will continue to push the use cases around gaming and enterprise, and we can get into more detail around that. Yeah, and then on the mobile side, with AR, it's very hard to deny just the potential there. I think unlike VR, you know, we're not limited by the hardware side. It's really more about product market fit, finding those experiences that consumers are really and enterprises are really gravitating towards, building up the software tools to enable those, and then in the AR platform stacks, like adding new features to support these use cases. So again, we can get into more of that, but on the AR side, you know, the number, you know, future revenue numbers being larger than the VR side makes total sense. And a lot of the way I think about it is, you know, when I think about AR revenue, it's actually kind of a bit hard for me to define. I think of it more as mobile revenue and mobile use cases that have AR features built into them.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And so on that topic, you know, with AR, you know, how do you see the evolution of AR as being, you know, a driver for VR? Because, you know, at some point, AR and VR take, you know, very divergent paths, with, you know, sort of AR really becoming more of a computing platform and VR really sort of being that destination. You're going into AR for a specific, reason, task, to learn something, do something, play something. So how do you see that evolution where we go from, mobile AR to wearables, and then how that's going to impact VR? And I think both of you, maybe we'll start with you, Stephen, and then Stephanie from your perspective.
Yeah, so there is a lot of common infrastructure between AR and VR. And rather than getting too detailed, in the technical side, it's just, if you just think about it as 3D objects, 3D workflows, 3D design, 3D user interfaces, the commonalities between the two. And so I think there's a lot of work to do and a lot of opportunity in making 3D development easier and easier and easier. And we've got, these fantastic tools that we've been able to borrow from the gaming industry with, Unity and Unreal and so on. It's just taking that kind of a trajectory that domain of tools and then expanding on them and making them easier and more accessible and able to run on lighter weight devices and so on. So I think there's a lot of commonalities in tools and then in the learning curve on things like UX that will come along the way. Then if you think about, when I think about AR and VR and those convergence points, that kind of like those tools, those experience curve, that's all kind of in the next 1 to 2 years. Then once we get beyond 1 to 2 years and we're looking at 2021, 2022, 2023, that's when I think there's a lot of convergence that can begin to happen on the hardware side, which is the wearable side. And now we're not talking about smartphone AR, we're talking about head-worn AR. And I think folks kind of call these maybe mixed reality headsets or whatnot. But the current generation of headset technology is really that we see on VR. It's based on these smartphone displays, and it's an amazing thing. But that smartphone display kind of approach kind of only gets you so far. Doesn't enable, or it's much harder to enable kind of an AR experience. And so I think by the time we're getting into 2021, 22, 23, we start to see that next generation of display technology, SoC technology, battery, and so on, that enables what I think people think of as like the real convergence between AR and VR, where you've got a wearable headset that is immersive.
Yeah, and then Stephanie, so in terms of the numbers, I mean, is that how, with your research, that 21 to 23 time frame, that seems to be, those are like the magic years. What are you seeing on the data side?
We see that as well. I mean, we see, the mixed and augmented reality wearables, as a point of comparison. So we see that hardware hitting 7 billion by 2021. And if you compare that to virtual reality's 10 billion, it starts to kind of catch up. And then I think Stephen made some great points in that's where you are going to start to see the real convergence. I think the long term, and I'm talking 15, 20, 30 years, is mixed reality, or is going to be those wearables that are really, going to be lightweight, that are going to be accessible to all types of users. Right now, the headset is just, headsets are problematic for different types of users, ethnically, gender-wise, and so on, and just the weight and the cumbersome nature of them. So those things will go away, and then you'll start to have wearables that can integrate both virtual and augmented reality in a mixed way. And that's really where I see, down the line, the endpoint being, and us at SuperData seeing that start to ramp up in the next 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, so let's go back to something that Stephen talked about. I mean, obviously the infrastructure piece, again, without getting too into the weeds, is an important element, in the evolution. And with AR cloud, AR browsers, I know Chrome is adding AR functionality. We've got companies like 6D AI getting funding, to build out cross-platform AR cloud. What are some of the important infrastructure steps that need to evolve for us to really truly get to that, wearable, kind of always on, mixed reality experience? And Stephen, do you want to take a crack at that?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I think so. What are the technologies to help us really get to that mixed reality wearable form factor? Yeah, so there's going to be so everything I mentioned around 3D assets, 3D asset management, 3D asset rendering and playback, all that kind of stuff. We have for as many 2D images out there that there are out there on the web, there's, we just don't have those 3D images. And we kind of think about it that way. It's like we need 3D models and objects uh, for all the things that you can imagine under the sun, and then being able to create those quickly, and marketplaces for that and all that stuff. So that's a big area. There's you mentioned kind of some of the AR SDKs that are being developed and out there. There's going to be a whole bunch of features that are going to be needed, and for specific use cases, be it self-expression, kind of selfies and sharing, or be it shopping or gaming, and all of these are going to have slightly different requirements. So I think over the next couple of years, you'll just see a gradual maturation or kind of evolution of these AR SDKs. With AR Core, launched as 1.0 and then updated to 1.1 and 1.2, and I think the reflection of kind of that incremental mentality that we have, and that there's a long way to go. Not sure when we'll get to 2.0, but at some point we will. But there's a lot of features there around persistence, sharing, scene understanding. At the end of the day, it's about opening up the camera and having it taking a view of the world, making sense of that in a way that a computer can, and also in the intuitive way that humans can, and then augmenting it and presenting us the scene back out to the user. So there's going to be a lot of features that are added on that front, and there's a lot of great innovation going out there in the ecosystem, which is very exciting to see with some of the companies you mentioned that are building on these AR SDK feature sets. Another big area that I think is important, especially with the coming of 5G, and will be, how does cloud computing and cloud rendering play into this? I don't think we know yet, but I'm excited to see over the next quarters and year or two that some of these streaming technologies become available for immersive use cases, and then seeing what developers do. And developers ultimately have to decide, how much processing they want to do on the client versus what kind of things they want to do on the cloud. But with technologies like 5G coming, more fiber to the home, and those types of things, the promise of high bandwidth, low latency networks, I think, are going to open up some real possibilities for developers. And again, I think the timeframes are pretty good. By the time you look at 3 to 4 years from now, you'll start to see things like cloud rendering go from a concept to closed beta or pilot of some sort, to actually developers starting to use it, and then deciding, when we get to those wearable form factors a few years from now, how heavyweight they need to be. And I think in some use cases they'll be very heavyweight and a lot of client-side processing, and then in other cases where people will want more mobility, they'll want lighter weight, better ergonomics, and then they might do more streaming. So that's just a smattering, I think, of some of the foundational technologies that I'm excited to see develop over the next few years.
That's great. So I'd love to switch gears a little bit, and Stephanie, and talk about, I'd like to touch on both sort of the consumer-facing side of this, but also enterprise, and really, what are the solutions, what are the opportunities on the enterprise side for AR and VR, and what should companies be looking at in terms of integrating this technology? And then we can kind of switch gears over to the consumer side. But what are you seeing on the enterprise side as some of the best use cases and opportunities?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, on a strictly data level, we're seeing training and simulation really just skyrocket, and it makes sense. It's a really applicable use case. one of the things that is so important about VR is really being able, the most important things about making a compelling piece of content is that it really needs to be something that can't be done outside of VR in that way. You know, it's very rare that you find a piece of content where you can do something in real life and then do that thing in VR and it's more compelling or as compelling in VR. But with training, it's a little bit different in that there is an impossibility to it because there's the ability to there's a repeatability, right? So you can continue to do the same things over and over and learn from your mistakes. There's a safety factor that's a huge ROI for companies. You know, not having to worry about their employees getting hurt or you know, getting overexerted or things like that while they're training. So on that end, that's where we're really seeing a lot of huge strides. And I think Striver is the company that always seems to jump out at me because they're so diverse in their use cases in the training and simulation vertical. But you also have a lot of really interesting applications that go as far as medical and education. And then when we look at the design side, you know, architecture, engineering, construction, and design, you see some really compelling simulations, particularly in architecture. Again, kind of doing the impossible. So being able to traverse a building and go through and tour it before it's even been built is there's a presence that you don't get from just seeing a 3D model, and we're starting to see that become a way that VR is being used in a compelling way. And I think on the AR side, retail has been super interesting, finding ways not only, you know, like Sephora. I love Sephora personally, and being able to kind of shop at home. It's such a beautiful application of something that you know, it makes sense. And so on the AR side, being able to be a couch consumer essentially and do the impossible in that you're at home doing what you would normally do at a store. I mean, these are the applications that we're seeing proliferate.
Hopefully this isn't going to make me lazier than I already am when it comes to shopping. So Stephen, Google's involved in you know, all aspects, and there's been some, you know, really impressive projects on the enterprise side. Can you talk about some of the standouts and how you are, you know, helping and advising companies, you know, really build a scalable model, you know, that includes that sort of 3D asset management that you mentioned earlier, and how to really look at this in a larger scale than just getting stuck with, you know, 1 or 2 POCs.
Yeah, and the enterprise side is an area that's super exciting, and there's so much potential there. And what excites me is I see these POCs, I see these pilots with real ROI, verifiable, positive ROI, and so that's a great place to start with. But I think the key with kind of making sure that as you're building your kind of AR, VR, ISV for enterprises, is that you focus on, you know, the areas which are really showing the most promise. And so, you know, similar to the categories there, I think the way I kind of think about it is, you know, kind of a 3 buckets: help me learn, help me sell, and then help me work. And the help me learn is, as you mentioned, there's the training side. There's a lot of this procedural training. I saw a fantastic demo yesterday that's getting to help train medical students on surgery, and many of us have seen things like that. But it's just a fantastic one yesterday, and it's getting adopted by medical schools, which is fantastic. So there's kind of that procedural training, which can be so powerful. But also there's the human factors training, and tapping into the power of immersive computing to deliver kind of the empathy aspect. And so if it's about customer service, it's about negotiations, if it's about any kind of, think about the HR trainings that you do, and you want to help people, have better empathy towards their customers, coworkers, or partners, or so on. VR can be a great way to do that. So I think there's a lot of potential in Help Me Learn. In terms of the timing of that, I think that one is happening now. I think that's a great area to investigate, to work on, and to spend time in. Then there's this thing I mentioned called it Help Me Work. That's very, very broad and includes everything from kind of the telepresence, multiplayer telepresence, collaboration type of things, which I think is a little bit further out, just based on where we are with the technology, not on the customer demand, but on the technology side. But I think an area that is more tangible and more tangible today is around two things. One is design, and that can be design of buildings, facilities, or it can be around the design of objects, machinery, and so on. But the idea of visualization of these 3D objects in AR or VR, frankly, to make them more tangible is really powerful. And just a quick example is, if you are reviewing, the design of a hospital, and you want to make sure that the space as designed is going to work well for the people who will actually be working in that hospital. You need to find a way to take the perspective drawings and the top-down drawings, and share those with the people who will be working, and ask them to abstract that into kind of what that space is going to look and feel like. It's very hard. So then, today your alternative is to mock that up with some kind of a scale model, which is expensive and time-consuming. And frankly, it's a scale model, so people have to project their size down into this space. But with AR and VR, you can call it instantly, but very relatively easily create a walk-throughable model of the place, and much less expensively. And then also you can distribute that just like any digital goods. You don't have to bring people to a place to see the model. You can actually just hit send or share it, on a share it over a file server or Google Drive or what it is, and then people can experience that remotely. So you could have people all across the country or all across the world who are going to be involved in working in this space, giving you feedback, and so that can be really powerful. The last area I'll mention, kind of around the Help Me Work, is remote assistance, and I actually don't think of this as really an AR or VR thing. I just think of this as remote assistance. And there's going to be times when remote assistance needs nothing more than just simple chat. There's going to be times when remote assistance needs nothing more than video conferencing. And then there will be times when you need the AR visualization, so that you can both kind of be looking at the same 3D space and interacting in that 3D space. But that's another big area. And I think both of those are, again, relatively near term. And then there's Help Me Sell, which is product sales and helping people visualize what's going on and transporting them to a place. And I think that'll come along as well. But the areas that I'm most excited about really Help Me Learn and Help Me Work.
Good. So I just want to take a moment too and let everyone who's joined us today know that we are taking some questions, and you can type them into the chat, and I will try and make sure that we get everyone's questions answered. So feel free to start with that. And so let's move a little bit now towards the consumer side, and that Help Me Sell starts to bleed into that world as well. The consumers' adoption has been a little bit slower than everyone expected, especially with VR. And I think part of it is that lack of understanding of just how consumers are going to interact with 3D objects, and what does that look like, and what does that feel like for them. And when you talked about the next generations of AR core, I think some of those interactions will be baked into some of the future generations of the SDK. But in the meantime, how can we engage consumers in a way that is compelling, that makes them excited about these sort of 3D objects in their field of view and interacting with them, both on the AR and the VR side. And again, I'd love both of you to take a shot. Maybe we'll start with Stephanie.
Sure. Well, on the VR side, like I said, I can't tout location-based enough. So location-based entertainment, I think, is just a huge opportunity for, it really depends on placement. But being in places where there's organic foot traffic is huge. There's a spectator, an exhilaration from being a spectator as well as being a user. So if you have folks in VR and other people are able to see them in VR as they're shopping at a mall, or as they're at the airport, or at a tourist attraction like Madame Tussauds, or what have you, there's these examples of places where people are already there for other reasons. And those are the folks who are not the proactive consumer. Those are the people who are not going out and researching and trying out a PC headset or a PSVR. And so I think that's one of the big ways that we're going to see awareness grow for virtual reality in particular, and eventually headset augmented or mixed reality. On the AR side, specifically, right now what we have is mobile AR, which is great in one sense because there are so many people who have access to mobile AR just by virtue of having a phone that is capable of running it. There is the issue that you're kind of looking through a screen, and so that can be really cumbersome, and that's something that the content really needs to overcome. So, the content has to be compelling and useful in a way where it makes sense to hold up your phone. And I remember when Pokemon Go first came out, even, before true AR came into the app, there was a lot of that sort of hesitation of, people are going to be walking around and getting hit by cars in the street and whatever. It's not happening, so that's good news. We're seeing Pokemon Go still be successful without, it being this huge issue that a lot of people had anticipated. And so I think AR can evolve in that same way. But what makes Pokemon Go an exceptional example is that it's compelling in a way where the AR is an enhancement to the experience, but not essential. And so people have the choice to opt in, and when they do, they get a reward in that experience of immersion. But it's something that is integral to the gameplay if you do use it. So it's about being creative with the AR on mobile in a way where people are actually going to want to sit there and hold up their phone in the meantime until we get to wearables.
Right. So let me go to a couple of questions here. Let's see. So this one is specifically for Stephanie, who says of that 16 billion for VR software, hardware, what does that break down by category, use, education, medical, entertainment? Thanks. So maybe give us a breakdown of percentages by vertical if you have that.
Well, what I can say is the revenue figures that we do put out publicly are consumer, because on the enterprise level, it's really a question of how you measure revenue. And I think it would be a difficult thing to do to say that, and education is X billion dollars when you don't really know how you're going to be measuring that. Is it, does revenue come from internal R&D? Does revenue come from, hiring outside companies to help with development? So on that end, we just feel that the most interesting way to position enterprise is in terms of R&D versus external investment, which is data that we can discuss if you want to get in touch. And then on at least virtual reality software side for the consumer, definitely by far we see that games is just the natural fit. in terms of what's leading the way. So games really, you know, in the $1 billion dollar scheme of things for this year, games are almost half that. And it just, like I said, it just kind of makes sense in that you're talking about one of the main ways that people use it. Also, folks that are using VR for non-enterprise, they tend to be very tech savvy and often hardcore gamers, because there is so much research that goes behind it, and there's so much investment that also goes behind it. But on the location-based end is where we see also some really interesting growth, and I won't keep, you know, going on and on about it, but it's one of the bigger segments in there. And what we do cover, you know, if you break it down, the games, location-based, those are two of the bigger ones. And then going from there, you know, interactive media. So what we consider interactive media is anything that's not necessarily a game. It doesn't have a clear objective, but it is gamified in some sense. So one of those things that we would look at would be Google Tilt Brush, for instance. You know, we see that as something that's gamified and interactive, but not quite your Beat Saber, where you have a specific objective and there's a winner, or something that makes you a quote unquote winner. So that's one of the places where we see a lot of potential, and that becoming, alongside with social media, the third and fourth biggest verticals by 2021.
I hope that answered that question. And then I have another question, and I'm going to kind of combine a couple of questions here, looking at you know, events and entertainment, both, you know, live and produced. You know, maybe, and again, I think maybe both of you have a good perspective on this. So Stephen, in terms of you know, Google's purview, do you see the live entertainment and even eventually sort of home use of entertainment with, you know, AR, VR? How's Google viewing that and sort of preparing for it?
Yeah, so it's a great question. Overall, with the kind of live versus produced, what I'd say is, you know, very pragmatically in the early days of immersive video, I think that's what we're talking about, video here. If we're talking about something else, let me know. But there's a lot of different problems to solve across the whole workflow, from capture and cameras to stitching to editing to post-production to hosting and serving and client playback and everything. And so there's no doubt that doing things in a post-production kind of environment rather than live affords you a lot more time and to put in the care that's needed to make sure everything works well. And so you know, most of the content that you should see is really going to be produced. That said, I think that it's really about, like, hey, you know, what is the experience that you want to capture? And oftentimes, you know, live is great. Live has worked really well, obviously, for game streaming and things like that. Quite a bit now for live streaming as well, which has perhaps made a resurgence driven by China. But there's a lot of experiences where you really want something produced, and we've done both. You know, red carpet experiences that are live with a produced condensed cut afterwards, special tributes and things that commemorate certain moments and activities that are produced. And so I think it's just, you know, coming up with the right, call it the right creative to match the moment that you've got. Knowing, of course, that the produced side is going to be a bit easier.
Okay, and then I'm going to go one more question, and then I'd like to go back to the consumer side. And Stephen, you mentioned surgical training. You know, there's a lot of work on the behavioral health side, and I think that within behavioral health and even on the empathy side of things, what are some of the solutions that you know, you're seeing beyond the one you've just mentioned?
Yeah, so and this is an area I must confess I'm not a deep expert on, especially when you get into things that are really about therapeutics. Just there's a whole industry and a set of expertise, and in medicine that I just don't have. But I would say that there's been a lot with that I've seen that I think is really exciting with kind of more behavioral trainings. So things like exposure therapy, which I think can be very, very effective and compelling, and the data I've seen backs that up in VR. And then also the human factors training, the stuff I mentioned. I saw a really wonderful demo on sexual harassment training. And it was just a fascinating experience and super compelling. And there's VR has so many different aspects that lead to this kind of training to be so effective, be exposure therapy or in this case sexual harassment. But I mean, just one that you've got the headset on and your focus is completely in the moment, in the scene. You are in that environment, and there's no looking away from the TV screen. There's no putting your head down on the desk. There's really no zoning out because you are in the scene. And then you can do things where you're kind of doing these important role plays where one demo I saw, it was a sexual harassment training, and you as the participant in the room, it was not clear whether or not your identity, your gender was male or female. And it worked equally well for both. But then afterwards, when folks debriefed about it, the impressions of the experience were dramatically different based on whether you assumed that your role in the scene was male or you assumed that it was female. And so you've got you're completely focused in the moment doing this thing. You were able to play around with some of these factors while the scene is going on, and then afterwards you have these fascinating debrief sessions because you're able to play around with some of these variables and elements. All of that, I think, leads to a much richer, deeper, and more impactful set of kind of trainings around human factor trainings in this case. But similarly, with any kind of behavioral training, there's just so much potential to play around with the environment and modify the variables to get better engagement, better impact, and better reflection.
And Stephanie, what do you see in terms of the data around healthcare, and is there a market yet, or are we still very much in the research phase? Because I know exactly the sexual harassment training, and I've actually working with that company and seen demos, and people walk away actually with visceral reactions to the scene that they had seen. And so, but is that translating into a viable market at this point?
Well, on the yes and no. Part of the issue is funding for these sorts of things, and then the other part of the issue is expertise. There's a really specific type of expertise that has to come with developing programs for this type of thing, and they don't necessarily overlap with the kind of expertise that it takes to develop for it. So there's an opportunity for specialized developers who can understand exactly what types of solutions are needed on the healthcare side. It's huge. And I would say on the demand side for VR firms, there is a fairly high percentage. It's the second most in demand vertical on the enterprise side in terms of companies looking for folks who can give solutions. That's second to education. And education is I mean, you could argue that a lot of these healthcare solutions are both educational and medical, but it is one of those places where you really do have to have an in-depth knowledge. And there are a lot of these organizations that don't have the type of funding that that for-profit businesses do. So I've heard, of the challenge that there are research labs, particularly I think behavioral health is one of the biggest in this case, and this is where I've heard this issue come up the most, in that there's not enough funding to be able to do this kind of research to find solutions that are interactive and immersive. So you have those two challenges, but if you can overcome if you can overcome them, or if you can find ways to parlay expertise in a unique fashion across both of those pieces, the tech and the scientific side, then it's a blue ocean. I mean, there are so many organizations that are looking for that. So I do think that it is a big point of opportunity.
That's great. And then sort of steering back to LBE, which, there's so much discussion on it now. And, you brought up a great point, Stephanie. There's a fundamental difference between the consumer with intention who is going to a VR arcade or a theme park that has a VR component, or some of the, the bigger installations like the Void and Dreamscape, which have been, very successful so far. And then catering to that organic consumer and foot traffic, and then that becomes more discovery. And can you talk a little bit about the differences in the metrics of those markets and what you're seeing as the uptick for each side of that coin?
Can you clarify a little bit? So on location-based, the different
Yeah,
sides of
yeah, so the difference in the markets between more the organic traffic and that discovery, like the installation we have at Periscape at JFK, that is that's organic foot traffic, and then installations like the Void and Dreamscape, to the mom and pop arcades across the country. What are the differences in sort of the market opportunity for each sides of that coin?
Okay, yeah, that's a great question. On the arcade side, we saw a lot of shutdowns in the last year. We saw a lot of arcades open up, but you do have that challenge in that you're looking for you're trying to entice consumers to come and use that venue on their own. Get in their car, go specifically there to do that. And so IMAX actually is a really interesting example because they have a little bit of both, and both have been a challenge for them. So on the one hand, they have their LA location, which is purely VR, and it's very difficult. Throughput is very low. When you get there, you have to make appointments to do the different experiences. I mean, there are a lot of barriers to being able to do a seamless experience going through all of the installations. And then, here in New York, you have the IMAX combination of the movie theater with the VR center. And yes, you have organic foot traffic, but this is one of those cases where people are going somewhere else for a very focused purpose. They're going to a movie, and they have to be at that movie at a certain time. They're going to sit 2 hours in the theater, and the last thing that they're going to want to do is be completely immersed once again in a number of different installations that they have to wait, a timeline for, and so on. So it's really important to think about those elements in location-based, and so that's why I really feel like you do have your very successful or pretty successful companies like the Void that have their dedicated locations, and I think that the reason why they are able to succeed in that is because they have such a unique experience that you cannot really replicate. You can replicate it if you do a completely immersive, room scale sort of proprietary experience of your own, but the Void has their proprietary experiences that take advantage of a large scale of space, very tactile. They're like smell. There's all kinds of things that go into it. That it's not just you're sitting in a headset and seeing something for a couple minutes and it's really cool, but then you kind of move on with your life. You're having this really unique experience you can only have there. And that's why I think that actually does work versus where you're kind of jumping to different experiences that are very short, that are time-based, that can just be so cumbersome. And then when you have experiences like Periscape, I mean, I think what's really interesting about that one is being in an airport, you have nothing to do a lot of the time. You're just waiting. It's not you're not there for any other reason but to wait and then get on a plane. And so and there are crowds, and there's just so much that goes into enticing someone to spend that time doing something more interesting. And so if you have organic foot traffic in an airport or a mall, there's a lingering. People are just kind of hanging out in those spaces. And if they're hanging out in those spaces, they might want to hang out and do something unique like VR, as opposed to going somewhere with a specific purpose that's not VR.
Mm-hmm. And Stephen, how does Google really look at LBE market? Is it something that you will work with some of your partner companies to enable? What's the sort of overall thought process and strategy around LBE?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, so it's an area where we are talking to partners, talking to companies about ways that we can work together. It's not an area that we see as something that we would go into, directly. So it's really about how can we enable and support. And overall, it's an area that has a lot of potential. I think it's very exciting and very interesting. And it's funny. I remember, 3 years ago, and discussions around kind of venue-based VR, and there's this kind of general sense that the arcades and computer cafes, internet cafes, that phase is gone, and U.S. consumers are not into that. The truth is, U.S. consumers are into great experiences, and they're into having great, powerful experiences, and wherever that they are available. And a lot of the location-based experiences today are exactly the kind that well, certainly if you're not kind of into tech, you would not be able to set up at home. But even if you are into tech, some of these really large-scale walkable experiences are just not feasible at home. And so I think it's very exciting to see how these things are going to develop over the next few years. I'm quite bullish on it and really excited. So, we're looking for ways that we can support location-based experiences, location-based VR with platform technologies, but also with content and experiences, right? So Tilt Brush was mentioned earlier, and that's an experience that I think shows up in a decent number of locations. Job Simulator as well, and so there's those types of experiences, and I mentioned video earlier on, and so kind of immersive experiences that transport you to new places. So we're excited and looking forward to supporting and finding creative ways to work together. The last thing I'd mention is what for folks out there who are thinking about location-based VR is that what's going to work. It's very that's another word, but very culturally sensitive, and so you have to make sure that usage patterns for folks in the U.S. Might be a certain way, but if you get across over to Japan or Korea or even China, what consumers are willing or not willing to do, how far they're willing to travel or not willing to travel, the level of quality that they're expecting to experience, and all of that will vary greatly. And so I think it's one of these things where it's really important to be local and sensitive to local needs and local desires, and not think that what's working in one, I'll call it like one country or one region, is going to work in another.
Yeah, so that's actually an interesting point you brought up, and Asia has been a little bit ahead in terms of adoption, and so in terms of the overall trajectory of the industry, what kind of, you mentioned a couple. What are some of the other insights that we can glean from the way that AR and particularly VR have evolved in Asia? Maybe Stephen, you can start with that.
Yeah. So why don't I start, and then I would say that looking at Asia, there's particularly on the AR side. Oh my goodness! I mean, there's just so much innovation going on with selfies, augmentation, self-augmentation, that's really exciting and very, very innovative. And of course, we're seeing things like that here as well with Snap and Facebook. But I think that there's a lot for us to learn, a lot for the world to learn from Chinese consumers, particularly on self-expression and self-augmentation, the selfies and sharing. So that's really exciting. I think the other thing that I'd note is that on the VR side, there is which is it's inherently a hardware-based thing, is that when you look at China, there's so much innovation on the hardware side, and that is carrying out in both VR headsets as well as AR headsets. And so I always look to China to kind of help inform me on what's at the cutting edge of what is possible with hardware. A lot of those prototypes or even products have to be taken with a grain of salt because the quality is not always there. But I mean, it's an amazing place where the innovation is being pushed on the hardware side. And I think that there will be a lot of lessons learned about what's possible, what works and what doesn't work that comes out of China on the hardware side. And then over time begins to get refined, polished by companies in China as well as companies outside of China, and then become mass market mainstream products, mainstream hardware products. So I look at that kind of on the wearable side, the hardware, and then on AR, just self-expression. It's fantastic.
Great. And Stephanie, any sort of final thoughts before we wrap up today?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is being realistic and being patient and feeling okay about the fact that what we had hoped for by this point is a little different than what is actually happening. The VR industry is still very, very young, especially if you consider in the long term what we can expect from it. It's going to be so transformative and it's going to be extensive. So it took smartphones quite a few years to find their way, and it's not nearly as complex, I would argue, as what we're looking at for mixed and augmented reality. So there are really interesting, unique, innovative monetization opportunities that obviously we don't have the time to go through everything right now, but they're there. And they're going to continue to grow. And I think finding those opportunities and being realistic about which ones are actually viable is going to be key to finding success in the near term.
Great. And Stephen, a little final thought from you?
Yeah, it's a very it continues to be a very exciting time. I think there's been some disillusionment, especially on the VR side, in the last year or so. But I think I always anchor back to looking at those revenue numbers and seeing when you've got billions of dollars of revenue coming in from paying customers, that's investment that's going to be put to good use to help us all refine the products, refine the hardware, refine the software, and improve the offering. So I see those revenue numbers, and it tells me that products there are interesting, consumers and enterprises are responding to them, and then that money is going to be reinvested in a very effective way. So and then looking forward, it's the next couple of years are going to be very interesting on the smartphone AR side, as well as continued refinement and evolution on VR, and then we get into that 3-year to 5-year out time frame where I think just the hardware cycles are going to allow us to have some really kind of step function next level type of hardware experiences that'll unlock a lot. So I think it's been a great journey, at least for me, in the last few years, along with folks on the call here in this industry. The next couple of years will be very interesting as well as we refine, and as on the AR side as we really explore and define. And then I think there's going to be some very interesting, exciting developments on the hardware side that are going to make true immersive wearables possible. So I'm excited.
Yeah, I second that. I think we're all very excited, and thank you both so much for joining us today. I'm going to pass it back to Pete Kartkeek from VRX and VR Intelligence, and thank you everyone for joining us. Pete?
Thank you very much, Amy, and thank you to Stephen and Stephanie too. Unfortunately, I received a note from Vinay just 5 minutes or so into the webinar, and unfortunately he had a family emergency that he had to attend to, was on his way to hospital, unfortunately. So just to give you a heads up on why he wasn't on the webinar. We will send out the recordings over the next couple of days, so look out for those. They'll appear in your inbox. You'll be able to listen again to some of the great insights that we've had from the three panelists on the webinar today. Just to reinforce that this webinar was set up in the run-up to VRX 2018, which takes place in San Francisco on December 6 and 7. I know a lot of you know about it already, but it's a leading VR B2B event, looking at the future of VR and AR across business, consumer, entertainment, and society as a whole. So it's a very senior level event, and we get a great crowd along. So look out for some notes from me off the back of the webinar. But thanks very much. Have great days, have great evenings, and speak to you soon. Thanks very much. Take care.
You have been removed from the call.